What you wanted to know about nuclear but didn't ask. Out of all forms of power generation, I take the bet and say, nuclear is the most mysterious of them all. From its beginnings in the 1942 graphite piles, to the nuclear-powered rocket concepts. But how does it work? If you have watched the standard explanation of uranium breaks, sends neutrons, neutrons break more uranium, send neutrons, and so on. That seems weird, doesn't it? Why doesn't every reactor explode sort after starting up then? Neutrons should multiply more and more till the whole thing turns into a giant nuclear bomb. But there's reactors in every continent, and they aren't giant radioactive craters, so why is that? Nuclear reactors, unlike nuclear bombs, nuclear reactors have lower than 1 neutron multiplication rate for instant neutrons, or prompt neutrons, but close enough to 1 so that the so-called delayed neutrons, the ones which are released by decaying nuclear fragments, fill in the gap and are able to give a greater than 1 multiplication, even though the fast chain reaction, to call it that way, is not actually in explosion mode. Alright, so the explosion is delayed. Instead of taking milliseconds, it takes seconds, since one has to wait for the, let's call them, decay neutrons to show up each time. So why won't they explode? As you may guess, seconds is enough time to push some material in the reactor to absorb some of those neutrons, and take it back once it seems there's a lower than 1 multiplication. That way it is possible to even it out at 1, so it won't grow over time and explode. And the neutrons won't die off either. That material is what we normally call control rods. That's not the whole story yet, but let's take a deviation first. You may have wondered, if reactors like Fukushima had problems with hydrogen explosions, and that's because there's water in the first place for it to break down, then why will people keep using water for their reactors? Why don't they use something else which has no hydrogen in it? Remember the absorbing neutrons by inserting some material strategy. Water does is something way more elegant. It slows down neutrons, making it more likely for fission to happen at raising odds compared with the odds of the neutron being absorbed by U-238, for example. That's fine enough, but why do I bring it up, if water is pretty much doing the contrary of the control rods? It is pushing for an explosion to happen. But here's the trick: what if water gets hot? If you allow it, it will expand, right? Once it expands by boiling or otherwise, and there's less hydrogen particles going around, you would think the odds of a neutron hitting the hydrogen one and time again keeps going down, doesn't it? On top, the neutrons bouncing around the hot water will never be able to slow down as much because hydrogen in it is moving faster than when the water was cold, so it will actually end up pushing around the neutrons rather than the other way around. That happens with any moderator material you would ever want to use, but the loss of so-called moderation, by boiling or otherwise, that alone can stop the reactor from heating up further, as the faster neutrons get absorbed by U-238 instead, as long as it is barely above 1 to start with. Water is pretty much a low-tier automated control for the reactor, one which doesn't need to meter the neutrons, to use thermostats, complicated control rods and so on. You still have your rods, but rely on water to do the tiny adjustments for you. Let's go with the next one. Maybe someone in the past you may have wondered, why does people keep using nuclear even though it is so dangerous? Look at Chernobyl for example, and if its waste is dangerous for an arbitrarily long number of years, I do not dare to mention a number, then why? For once, you have been lied to. Nuclear energy, even if you consider the type of reactor used at Chernobyl, is still better in terms of lower deaths than coal when you compare the power production of each. Thousands die each year due to coal, even though we keep trying to make it cleaner. Nuclear, on the other hand, is so scary, we actually take it seriously, and even the Soviet, not great not terrible reactors were, as I understand it, safer than standard black rock of lung disease aka coal. So what about the nuclear waste? Well, there's one thing they don't tell you. Real nuclear waste overall will be less radioactive after a couple hundred years than the rocks you got the uranium from in the first place. It's weird to say this, but Earth will be less radioactive less than 200 years from now than it was 200 ago, if we store the waste underground. So why it is a problem, and why it is dangerous if I say that real waste is not. Here's the trick. I said real waste. Spent nuclear fuel rods, which is the most dangerous nuclear waste of them all, still has plutonium and transuranics in it. Yes, it has plutonium which could be used in a reactor. So why is there plutonium in it? Why doesn't it get consumed in the reactor in the first place? There's three big reasons. First, reactors meant to burn uranium aren't ideal for burning plutonium, mainly because plutonium's decay neutrons take shorter time to show up, so the reactor needs to balance itself faster than a uranium one, so as the fuel burns and there's more plutonium in it left from those U-238 atoms which catched a neutron back then. That plutonium is going to make the reactor harder to control. Old reactors weren't always made for it, so they couldn't use it safely enough. But why does it persist today? Because slow neutrons are bad at burning it, and the fuel gets slowly filled with fission products. The fragments of the previous broken atoms accumulate and start absorbing neutrons which should be splitting uranium or plutonium. They essentially end up stopping the reactor. Okay, so it won't get burned, but why leave it in the rods? Why not gather the plutonium and feed it to a reactor meant for it? Because plutonium is worth about $8 million as far as I remember, per kilogram. Do you think in the process of extracting that plutonium some rogue worker or group of them could make half a gram disappear here and there? Is up to $2,000 or so per time if is high quality stuff, less so for crappy stuff, but even if is worth $20 for half a gram, someone somewhere would do it. Since there's that risk and nuclear is scary, many people, many governments around the world have decided to sack up their waste instead of process it, waiting for a future government, not them, to have to deal with the problem. But why won't people just be more careful handling that plutonium? Why not use robots for the process and make sure no one can enter? You do control the robots at a distance, and you record everything with cameras, so what's the problem? Imagine the risk of that venture in many countries. The Superphénix reactor, a French plant meant to deal with nuclear waste by burning it, got attacked with an RPG. Someone actually fired at a nuclear reactor which would have dealt and did something to deal with the very problem many people have with nuclear waste. Is kind of sad in my view. Lather on it worked till it got closed. That's also part of the problem. In the nuclear world, the same solutions that one try to put to fix the problem get stepped on. Then there's complaints the problem ain't solved. But how is it that nuclear is less historically lethal than fossil fuels, or even less so, as incredible as it may seem, as wind turbines, or even solar panels set up in a roof? How could that even be possible? I answer with another question. Do you hear each time some wind turbine burns up with people on it? Each time a worker dies in a turbine. Each time some dude falls off a roof, or the old people that die in China due to living in a city contaminated by the local coal plant. Not so often. Why? Which gets more views? The whatever meltdown you can think of, or those other deaths? What does create more profit for the news? What is newsworthy to them? Then, do you think politicians even tend to care if is not newsworthy? If people won't care, they don't need to either, and if people cares more about avoiding nuclear accidents, then they will work in that direction, right? That's how we end up in a world with more or less deaths depending on how newsworthy it is. More newsworthy, more action against it, so less deaths over time. Less newsworthy, less action against it, so more deaths over time. There's some extra minutes left before this thing gets too long, so let's add another question. What's the deal with nuclear fusion? Why is it that we have nuclear fusion ever since 1952 in form of bombs, but we don't have commercial nuclear fusion to power entire cities? Two reasons, and have nothing to do with the fusion is too hard argument, which forgets about the fact there's known energy gain from nuclear fusion ever since 1952. First, try to explain to the public, politicians and whatever military that you can think of, that your plan is to mass-produce nuclear bombs by about 200 or so per day, and doing so cheaply. On top you will be detonating about 2 per day per reactor, and you need for it to pay off over normal nuclear, even though you need an over 100 meters tall and about 30 or more wide cavity lined with steel, made hundreds of meters under the ground. Not saying it is utterly impractical, just saying, try to explain that. That's the first reason. The second is the main plus of fusion is cheap and less dirty fuel. But if fission fuel is already worth less than a cent per kilowatt-hour, why would you care about going big with fusion? Instead, what people do is being careful enough with the nuclear waste and fund fusion, but only bit by bit in hopes someday it will be worth it. While the people looking at lowering costs and waste for fission take a look at breeder reactors, mass production in form of small nuclear reactors, floating power plants, any combination of each allowed by the only proven nigh absolute laws in existence: the laws of physics. To finish, I want to add something about why people keep using water. Because it was a short explanation, I must say that water won't do much to regulate the reaction if it's not allowed to expand. Like in a pressurized water reactor or PWR, in a boiling water reactor or in a not yet made supercritical water reactor, that is a thing, the local expansion of the water allowing for even higher neutron speeds, and less multiplication of the reaction, keeps the reactor stable as long as the power does not increase quickly enough to isolate the rods by the utter drop in density due to the heat in a film around them. That's because less dense water has less heat conductivity too, so it will be bad at sending that heat over the rest of the water in between the rods and have it expand for the let's call it water autocontrol to work. So it ain't a magic wand, but it makes life easier. It is not yet complete explanation, but this is an introduction sort of video. If you like it, please subscribe, hit the like, and leave suggestions for a next video in the comments, which I expect will get upvoted, and therefore give an indication of the comment positive popularity, though sadly comments don't have visible negative votes in YouTube. But never mind, at least it approximates an optimal solution. May knowledge be with you.